Welcome to Everyday English Pod. We're diving into some real-world business English today.
Sounds useful.
It is. We've got this collection of business conversations, the kind of thing you might overhear in an office.
Uh-huh.
And we're going to pick them apart.
Okay.
See how people really communicate to get stuff done, especially in American workplaces.
So practical insights into how business English is used.
Exactly. Think of it like your cheat sheet for understanding the American business world.
I like it.
All right, so let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
First up, project timelines. These conversations really emphasize how important it is to get everyone on the same page about the when and the what right from the start.
Yeah, that's crucial, isn't it? Before you even start doing anything.
Yeah, it's like setting your destination in the GPS before you even get in the car,
Right. And there's a good reason for that. When you're clear about the scope from the beginning, you dramatically reduce the chances of what we call scope creep.
Scope creep.
Yeah, that's when the project starts to expand beyond the initial plan. New features get added, deadlines get pushed back. It's a real budget killer.
Oh, I see.
Studies actually show that this scope creep can add an average of 30% to both the time it takes to complete a project and the money it costs.
Oh, that's a lot.
It is. So by being super specific about what needs to be delivered early on, you're saving yourself a whole lot of hassle and wasted resources down the line. And these conversations actually mention a couple of key things.
Yeah.
Defining a kickoff date, and everyone agrees, okay, this is when we actually start. And then identifying what they call critical dependencies, basically figuring out which tasks rely on other tasks being finished first. It's all about that order of operations.
It is.
And you can hear in these conversations that it's not just about talking about it, it's about actually doing something.
Right.
There's one conversation where someone's like, oh yeah, I've already whipped up a preliminary chart, outlining the tasks and who's doing what.
Oh, wow. Organized from the get-go.
Exactly. And the other person is like, let me see it. I want to give you feedback right away.
I love that energy.
It's that quick, direct approach. It's very typical, I'd say, in American business culture.
It's all about taking action and keeping things moving.
And of course, you can't talk about projects without talking about money. Budgets, right?
Oh, yeah, the dreaded budget.
But in these conversations, it's not so much dreaded. It's more like treated with respect.
Yeah.
There's a real awareness of needing to stay within the approved limits. But what's really interesting is the way they go about problem solving when those limits feel tight.
So what do?
They actually talk about maybe scaling back on some of the optional features.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance, making the numbers work while still delivering what's absolutely essential.
Making those tough choices, huh?
And there's this great line where they're talking about making sure they get user feedback early on to avoid disappointment later down the line. It shows real commitment to getting it right the first time.
They even suggest doing a quick user feedback session.
Exactly. And that's not just about making users happy. It's about smart project management. Catching those issues early on can save you a lot of headaches and money later.
Totally. Reworking things after they're already built, that's a nightmare.
Right. And speaking of getting things right, these conversations also dive into those internal approvals that are often necessary. Getting the green light from the higher-ups.
Oh, yeah. Can't forget about that.
They talk about how important it is to coordinate with management to get that approval smoothly. And again, you hear that emphasis on speed.
So it's not just about getting the work done, it's about navigating the company, too.
Right. Getting the work done is only half the battle. And then they talk about how crucial it is to present a clear plan and to follow up quickly.
Keeping everyone in the loop.
Exactly. Timely approval is key to keeping the whole project moving forward, keeping that momentum going.
Momentum is definitely important.
And it's not just about speed, of course. Quality matters too. They have a whole conversation about quality assurance protocols.
Like making sure everything works as it should.
Right. They even talk about scheduling a whole meeting just to discuss the testing requirements. It's about setting clear standards and making sure those standards are met.
I like that they're taking the time to really make sure everything is top-notch.
And as they move through all this, finalizing details, tweaking the timeline, they talk about updating the project file, sharing a revised contract draft.
Makes sense. Keeping everything up to date.
It's all about clear documentation so everyone knows what's going on.
What really stood out to me was how they talked about communication frequency in the agreement itself.
Oh, yeah. What did they say about that?
They actually specified that there would be mandatory weekly check-ins with the option for even more frequent updates, like daily if needed.
Wow, that's proactive.
Right. It's like they're saying, we're not going to let communication be a bottleneck.
Yeah.
They even mention how this helps them handle any unexpected changes more efficiently.
Makes a lot of sense. When you're in constant communication, you can react faster if something comes up.
And if you think about it, this kind of structured communication really helps with collaboration.
Oh, absolutely.
And make sure that everyone is aligned, working towards the same goals.
It's not just about talking for the sake of talking. It's purposeful communication.
Right. It's communication with a purpose.
Hmm.
And the ultimate purpose here, hitting that launch date.
Hitting that deadline.
Yeah. They actually set a deadline for the final revisions, just 2 days for feedback.
2 days. That's pretty tight.
I know, right? It shows how important it is to move quickly, but they also emphasize the need to stay aligned with all the company guidelines.
So speed and accuracy.
Exactly. Finalize that agreement, get it signed, and then boom,
Yeah.
implementation starts right away.
All right. So we've talked about timelines, communication, quality control. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about money.
Money.
Oh, boy. Well, specifically, managing expenses within a department. They start by looking at those big ticket items.
Like where's all the money going?
Right. Things like labor costs, fees they're paying to vendors, software licenses, that kind of thing.
The things that really add up.
And right away, they're looking at the bigger picture. How do these expenses compare to their projected income?
It's that classic balancing act, right?
Yeah.
Expenses versus income.
Exactly. They even point out that if costs keep rising without a corresponding increase in revenue, it could put a real strain on their profitability.
Yikes. Nobody wants that.
Nope. And then they start brainstorming solutions.
Hit with some solutions.
One idea is to negotiate better terms with their vendors. Maybe they could get a discount if they buy in bulk or sign a longer contract.
Makes sense.
And they even talk about involving the procurement department, the folks who handle purchasing for the company. Maybe they can leverage their relationships to get better deals.
Smart move.
Then there's a brief mention of maybe adjusting salaries or streamlining the workforce, potentially reducing headcount.
Oh, that's always a touchy subject.
Yeah, they even say it's delicate territory. But they quickly pivot to exploring other options first, like automating some of those repetitive tasks that eat up a lot of employee time.
Ah, the power of automation.
Right. And they have a really interesting discussion about the trade-off between investing money up front for automation versus those long-term financial benefits. You might have to spend some money to set up the automation, but it could save you a lot more money down the road.
Like paying a little now to save a lot later.
Right. But they're not just blindly jumping into automation. They actually talk about calculating the return on investment before making any decisions.
Data-driven decision-making.
Exactly. They want to gather data about the different tools that are out there, get some estimates for implementation costs. It's about making informed choices.
So it's about being smart about spending money, not just throwing it at a problem.
And speaking of being smart, they also talk about the importance of setting aside money for unexpected issues.
Oh, yeah, those unforeseen problems that always seem to pop up.
Right.
What if some key piece of equipment breaks down? Or there are major delays in getting materials from suppliers? They have to be prepared for that.
So what's the solution?
They suggest creating a contingency fund, maybe 5% of the overall budget, just to have that safety net for those unexpected expenses.
That's smart.
But even that 5%, they don't just pull it out of thin air.
They want to make sure it's a reasonable amount, I'm guessing.
Exactly. They talk about needing to confirm the revenue forecasts first.
How much money are they actually expecting to bring in?
Right. They even mention requesting updated sales predictions from the marketing team, because those predictions will help them determine how much they can realistically set aside for contingencies.
And they've got a deadline, right?
Oh yeah, the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
They're aiming to have the initial budget plan ready by Friday to meet the executive committee's deadline.
Sounds stressful.
Well, they're handling it well. They talk about putting together a comprehensive report beforehand and then having a quick review meeting before submitting it. Catch any mistakes, make sure everyone's on the same page.
Right. It's all about clear communication to get that budget approved quickly and avoid any surprises later on.
All right, so we've tackled project timelines and budgets. Now let's dive into marketing, specifically launching a new product.
This part is really interesting because they start by talking about how they need to constantly be reevaluating their marketing approach. It's not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
The market is always changing. Right?
Exactly. They're even wondering if they need to adjust who they're targeting or maybe try out some different marketing channels.
Keeping up with the times.
Right. And they actually have some data that suggests they might need to broaden their reach, particularly when it comes to using those social media influencers.
Oh yeah, influencer marketing is huge these days.
Especially especially with younger consumers. They trust those recommendations.
It's like word of mouth, but online.
And what's even more interesting is that they realize different customer groups might need different tactics.
You can't use a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. So they talk about partnering with industry experts for what they call thought leadership collaborations.
Thought leadership, what's that?
Basically, it means working with respected people in the industry to create content that positions the company as a thought leader, someone who really knows their stuff.
So it's about building credibility.
Exactly. And they see this as a way to appeal to those professional customers who might not be as swayed by social media influencers.
So going with a two-pronged approach, targeting both groups.
Yeah, a dual strategy. But they're also super aware of the need to coordinate the messaging carefully.
So the brand stays consistent.
Exactly. They even mention having clear guidelines for everyone who's creating content on behalf of the company.
So the messaging stays on point no matter where it appears.
Then the conversation shifts to paid advertising, those online ads you see everywhere.
Oh yeah, can't escape those.
Well, they acknowledge that paid ads can be a powerful tool to boost visibility quickly, but they're also cautious. They want to analyze the conversion rates before they invest too heavily.
Conversion rates, so like how many people who see the ad actually become customers.
Right. They want to see the data, the numbers, before they throw a bunch of money at it. It's all about making informed spending decisions.
I like that they're not just blindly throwing money at advertising.
And they're also big on prioritizing organic growth, attracting customers naturally.
Building a sustainable customer base.
Exactly. But they also realize that sometimes you need a little boost.
Especially for a new product launch.
Right. So they suggest a kind of hybrid approach, combining those organic strategies with some paid advertising to really maximize their reach quickly.
Getting the best of both worlds.
And then they bring up email marketing.
Good old-fashioned email.
Hey, it still works. They talk about how they can leverage their existing email list, those people who have already signed up to receive updates.
Reaching out to people who are already interested.
Exactly. And they even mention segmenting that list to send more personalized messages, which can really increase engagement.
Making those emails more relevant to each person.
So they've got this whole multifaceted plan, and now they need to get it approved by the higher-ups.
Selling the plan to the bosses.
Right. They talk about preparing creative briefs for each marketing channel, really showcasing how they're going to maintain that consistent brand identity.
So it's all coming together nicely.
What do you think is the most important factor in getting executive approval for this marketing plan?
Good question. I think it all boils down to the return on investment, the ROI.
ROI, that's always key.
Yeah. Executives want to know that the money they invest in marketing is going to generate more money in sales.
They want to see that positive return.
Exactly. So the team will need to provide data on things like market penetration, how many leads they expect to convert, and the overall projected revenue.
So you got to speak the language of money.
And they're on a tight timeline, too. They want to have everything ready for a final review meeting within 2 weeks.
2 weeks. They're moving fast.
Yeah. It's all about being proactive and trying to get ahead of the competition.
All right, so we've covered external strategies. Now let's shift our focus internally to leadership development.
Investing in their own people.
Exactly. And the conversation starts by identifying those key areas where managers might need additional training or support. Things like communication skills, conflict resolution, and even just, techniques for motivating their teams.
Helping those managers become better leaders.
Right. And they discussed different approaches they could take, like they could organize workshops in-house or maybe bring in some professional coaches from outside the company.
So they've got options.
And what's smart is that they're also thinking about the budget implications of each approach.
Got to stay within those limits.
They even suggest that a combination of internal and external resources might be the most cost-effective solution.
Getting the best bang for their buck.
Exactly. And here's another smart move they propose, starting with a small pilot program for leadership development.
Testing it out before they roll it out company-wide.
Right. It's a way to assess how effective the training actually is and make any necessary adjustments based on real feedback.
So it's a learn-as-you-go approach.
And they're also really focused on getting input from the employees themselves.
Makes sense.
There was a recent engagement survey where communication came up as a major area for improvement.
So they're using that feedback to inform the training content.
Exactly. They want to make sure the training addresses the actual needs of the employees. They even talk about incorporating interactive sessions where managers can practice skills like active listening and giving constructive feedback.
So it's not just theory, it's practical application.
Right. And they mention using role-playing exercises and simulations to make it even more realistic.
Learning by doing.
And they also recognize that a single training session isn't enough.
You need that ongoing support, right?
Exactly. They talk about the need for regular coaching or maybe peer mentoring to help those managers really solidify those new behaviors.
Making those changes stick.
So they propose this 3-month leadership development program with workshops and individual coaching sessions. And then they talk about logistics, coordinating schedules, getting the resources they need.
Making it all happen.
And a really important point they bring up is, how are they going to measure the effectiveness of this program?
You got to track results. Right?
Exactly. They talk about using key performance indicators or KPIs.
KPIs, those are the metrics that really matter.
Right. So in this case, they might look at things like employee retention rates. Are they keeping their employees longer? Or maybe project success rates. Are projects being completed on time and within budget?
If those numbers improve, it shows the program is working.
And their goal is to present this data to the executive board, show them the tangible improvements that are happening across different departments.
Making the case for continued investment in leadership development?
Exactly. And they're aiming to finalize all the details and get that program up and running within a month. Pretty impressive.
All right, shifting gears again. This time, let's talk about conflict resolution, specifically between the engineering team and the sales team.
Ah, yes, the classic engineering versus sales dilemma.
It happens everywhere, right? Sales is out there making promises, and then engineering is like, wait, we can't actually build that.
Exactly. And this conversation really highlights those common friction points. They start by talking about the need for a joint meeting.
Everyone together to hash it out.
Right, where both teams can openly clarify their expectations. They even suggest maybe having a neutral facilitator there to keep things calm.
Someone to mediate and keep things productive.
Exactly. And they talk about the importance of setting clear boundaries.
What can sales realistically promise? And what can engineering realistically deliver?
Right. Having those clear lines drawn up front can prevent a lot of those misunderstandings and arguments later on. It's about setting realistic expectations on both sides.
And better communication.
Exactly. Communication is key. And they emphasize the need to get input from both department heads.
Understand both perspectives.
Right. They want to know what the core issues are. And it turns out that a lot of the conflict stems from things like inadequate communication or unrealistic deadlines that are being imposed.
So it's not just about the technical details, it's about the process.
Right. And then they propose a solution, creating a unified project plan.
Something everyone can agree on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This plan would outline responsibilities, have built-in milestone reviews, points where everyone checks in to make sure things are on track. It's about creating structure and accountability.
So that everyone feels like they're part of the process.
Right. And they even suggest using a shared dashboard where everyone can track progress in real time.
That's a great idea. Transparency is so important.
And to keep the lines of communication open, they propose regular feedback sessions, maybe once a month, where everyone can share their thoughts and concerns.
Keeping that dialogue going.
They also acknowledge that sometimes you need outside help, and they actually mention involving the HR department if needed.
HR is often really good at conflict resolution.
Right. They have the experience and the tools to help mediate those tough situations. And the ultimate goal of all this is to create a more positive team dynamic.
Less conflict, more collaboration.
Exactly. When teams work well together, it leads to higher productivity and ultimately happier customers.
It all comes back to the customer.
And they wrap up that part by emphasizing the importance of good communication and finalizing those meeting details to get everyone together and start working towards a solution. They want to make sure everyone is on board.
That makes sense. Okay, shifting gears again. Let's talk about remote teams.
The modern workplace.
So much has changed, right? With more and more people working remotely, there are all these new challenges.
Yeah, they talk about the difficulties of coordinating across different time zones.
Especially when it comes to deadlines and communication.
Right, so they suggest establishing some standardized communication windows.
Times when everyone is expected to be available for live discussions.
Exactly. It helps with that real-time collaboration when you need it. But they also recognize that you can't always be online at the same time.
People have lives, right?
Exactly. So they also talk about the importance of documenting decisions clearly.
So that everyone's in the loop, even if they're not in the same room.
And then they mention using task management software.
To keep track of who's doing what and when.
Right. It's like that central hub for all the project information, especially when everyone's spread out.
It's so easy to lose track of things when you're not in the same office.
And they also address that feeling of isolation that can sometimes come with remote work.
When you're working from home, it's easy to feel disconnected from your colleagues.
Right. So they suggest actively encouraging virtual team building activities.
Like online social gatherings or something.
Exactly. Just informal ways to connect and build those relationships.
Keep that team spirit alive.
And they also talk about managers having those regular check-ins with their remote teams.
Making sure everyone feels supported and engaged.
Exactly. They want to make sure no one feels left out or forgotten. And then they mention having clear guidelines for things like video conference etiquette.
The do's and don'ts of online meetings.
Right. They even talk about updating their company manual to include best practices for working in these distributed teams.
Making sure everyone's on the same page.
And they also propose doing regular surveys, maybe quarterly, to get feedback specifically from those remote employees about the challenges they're facing.
Constantly learning and adapting.
So they're really putting a lot of thought into creating a supportive and productive environment for the remote workers.
That's great to hear.
All
right, let's move on to sales projections. They have a whole conversation about refining those projections for the next quarter, especially because the market seems to be shifting.
Yeah, it's all about staying ahead of the curve. They're wondering if they need to adjust their forecasts based on things like changes in consumer demand.
Are people still buying what they used to buy?
Right. Or maybe there are new competitors in the market or some bigger economic factors at play.
All those things can impact sales.
And some of the data they're seeing seems to suggest that competition is heating up.
More competitors entering the market.
So they start discussing possible price adjustments. Maybe offering some strategic discounts to stay competitive.
But discounts can cut into profits.
Exactly. So they're also thinking about ways to protect their profit margins. Maybe they could bundle products together.
Create those package deals.
Or offer some incentives for loyal customers, reward those repeat buyers.
Give people a reason to stick with them.
But they're not jumping into any major pricing changes just yet. They want to gather more intelligence first.
Makes sense.
They need to understand what their competitors are doing and what the customers are thinking.
Really understanding the market.
And they also need to consider any seasonal trends that might affect sales.
Some products sell better at certain times of the year.
Exactly. So they're taking a really data-driven approach to forecasting. They even talk about creating different models.
Some scenarios, right?
Yeah, like a best-case scenario, a worst-case scenario, and a few in between. It helps them be prepared for whatever happens.
So they're not just relying on a single prediction.
And they're also going to work with their research team to gather all the relevant data, consumer surveys, industry reports, all that good stuff.
Building that solid foundation.
Then they'll put together a dynamic forecasting model that they can present to the executive team.
And I bet the executives will appreciate that they're presenting both a conservative forecast and an optimistic forecast.
Yeah, showing the range of possibilities.
That kind of transparency is really valuable, especially in uncertain times.
And finally, they remember to loop in the operations team to make sure they can actually produce enough product to meet that forecasted demand.
Got to make sure the supply chain can handle it.
And they also want to check with procurement and logistics about lead times and inventory.
So they don't end up over-promising and under-delivering.
It's all about that coordination between departments.
All right, new product, sales projections looking good, time for launch.
A new product launch, always an exciting time.
They talk about the importance of having a really solid roadmap for the launch.
A detailed plan to make sure everything goes smoothly.
And they actually debate whether to do a phased rollout, region by region, or just go national all at once.
There are pros and cons to each approach.
A phased rollout lets you test the waters.
Exactly. You can see how the product is received in a smaller market, iron out any kinks before going big.
And they also talk about the importance of involving those key influencers.
Getting those early endorsements.
Generating buzz and building credibility.
And of course, they emphasize the need to make sure everyone inside the company is ready too.
Manufacturing, logistics, customer support, everyone has to be on board.
They even suggest allocating some budget for things like in-store demos.
Getting the product in people's hand.
Exactly. Those hands-on experiences can be really persuasive.
And they also want to make sure the sales team is well-trained.
They got to know the product inside out.
So they can answer any questions and really sell the benefits.
And throughout the whole launch process, they want to track those key metrics.
Measuring success, making adjustments as needed.
It's all about that data-driven approach. Analyze the results from the pilot launch before going national. Minimize those costly mistakes.
Smart move.
And finally, they mention working with their PR department to get some media coverage.
Getting the word out there.
So they've got a really comprehensive plan for making that new product launch a success.
All right, shifting gears again, this time Let's talk about performance reviews.
Ah, the dreaded performance review.
Well, they're actually talking about how to improve the process. They feel like the current system is a bit cumbersome and that the evaluations can be subjective.
It's tough to be completely objective when you're evaluating someone's performance.
So they're looking for ways to make the process more, well, fair and efficient.
They talk about incorporating more specific objectives and using measurable performance indicators.
So it's not just about gut feelings, it's about data.
Right. They want to set clear goals, track progress, and have concrete evidence to support the evaluations.
And they also suggest moving to quarterly check-ins instead of just annual reviews.
More frequent feedback is generally more helpful, right?
It gives employees a chance to course correct if needed, and it also makes the whole process less daunting.
Right. It's not just one big, scary review at the end of the year.
And then they start talking about technology, of course.
Oh, yeah. Gotta love technology.
They're wondering if they can use a platform to automate some of the administrative tasks, like sending reminders about goal setting and tracking progress.
Makes life easier for everyone involved.
And they really like the idea of having real-time data available so managers can get a better sense of what's happening.
That transparency can be really helpful.
And they also talk about the importance of providing consistent feedback to employees.
Not just during the formal review process, but throughout the year.
Regular feedback is key for growth and development.
And they recognize that managers might need some training on how to give that feedback effectively.
How to deliver constructive criticism in a way that's helpful, not hurtful.
Exactly. And also, how to set those clear objective goals in the first place.
So everyone knows what they're working towards.
And ultimately, they want to create a company culture that's supportive,
Yeah.
where continuous improvement is encouraged and valued.
A positive work environment.
So they plan to work with HR to create new review templates, gather feedback from some pilot departments, and then eventually roll out the revised process company-wide.
All right, new employees, that's our next topic. Onboarding, specifically.
Making sure those new hires get off to a good start.
Exactly. They've noticed that some new clients feel a bit overwhelmed during that initial onboarding process.
Too much information, too many new faces.
So they want to streamline things, make it easier for everyone.
Their first suggestion is to create a really simple welcome packet.
Something that's clear and concise.
Right. It would include key information like timelines, who's responsible for what, and how to communicate effectively.
Answering those common questions right up front.
And they also talk about assigning a dedicated account manager to each new client.
That single point of contact can be so helpful.
It helps build that relationship and makes it easier for the client to get the support they need.
They also suggest creating some tutorials or video walkthroughs for those more complex platforms.
That can save everyone a lot of time and frustration.
And of course, they emphasize the importance of getting feedback early on, making sure the onboarding process is actually meeting the needs of the clients.
And they also mention automating certain steps, like sending personalized progress updates.
Keeping those clients informed without having to manually send out emails.
And then they propose using a checklist so clients can track their own progress through the onboarding process.
Giving them a sense of control and visibility.
And once the checklist is complete, they want to schedule a kickoff call to address any outstanding questions.
Making sure everyone's on the same page before moving forward.
So they've got a whole plan to revamp that onboarding process, and their goal is to launch the new process next month.
Making those new client relationships strong from the very beginning.
All right, new markets, new opportunities. That's our next topic. They're talking about expanding into those emerging international markets.
Global.
And they start by identifying specific regions that have good growth potential.
But also manageable risks, right?
Exactly. They need to be smart about where they invest their resources. They specifically mention Southeast Asia as an area they're interested in.
A lot of potential in that region.
And they're very aware of the need to adapt their product or service to fit the local culture.